with the modern outlook on history than with the medieval outlook on history. As it probably was the beginning or the basis for modern historical thinking. And again, here we have to look at medieval views first of all, and then we'll take a look at how the humanist thinkers changed this and had a different view. Well, medieval education had been based on philosophy, scholastic philosophy, and stressed the use of reason and logic to discover one universal truth. Because that's what philosophy had always taught since antiquity, that people are rational, they can use reason to discover the one objective truth that's true for all people in all times and places. This led to a particular medieval view of history, where they saw all history as governed by one universal truth, one overriding plan or truth, which you could identify with religion or philosophy. It would be God's plan for all people in all periods, in all times. And history, the medieval thinkers saw as more or less just the working out of this universal plan or universal truth. And because history was just the working out of this one long plan, history was a kind of continuous period without too much change again. It's following one plot line, one blueprint, one plan throughout all times, and that doesn't really provoke a lot of change. And so they, again, as we've seen earlier, saw very little change occurring in history. Well, that's not how the humanists saw it. And the reason for that is the humanists, their basic intellectual viewpoint was not based on philosophy. It was based rather on rhetoric. And there's a big difference between the two, especially in the way they look at the nature of truth. And the way to really understand this is to look at where rhetoric comes from. And rhetoric goes back, like philosophy, to the days of ancient Greece. Some of the earliest teachers of rhetoric were the sophists in ancient Greece, who claimed to be teachers of wisdom, but who actually were, in fact, teachers of public speaking, and their job was to teach people how to make good arguments. The sophists developed an idea of truth, which we should call a kind of relative idea of truth. They saw truth as being relative to the good argument. The sophists would teach you how to make a good argument, and if you're convinced of it, then that in fact is the truth. So the convincing argument is true for those convinced. And there could be different truths for different people depending on who's convinced in what ways. And it's all based on this art of speaking, art of arguing, rhetoric, and convincing people of a point of view. So rhetoric in its very beginnings was based on a kind of relative notion of truth. And of course, the humanists inherit this relative notion of truth because they have such a deep concern for rhetoric in their educational program. Now, we've already seen why they had such a deep concern for rhetoric, because of the need to motivate the will, because of the need to communicate ideas effectively in society, and all that was extremely important. When we say that they inherited a relative idea of truth, you have to be careful because there's a conflict here, there's a tension here, because the humanists were also deeply religious, deeply Christian people. And of course, Christianity has a rather objective view of truth. It's, it's the truth of religion and what God has said. And so there's a kind of tension between the humanist rhetorical culture on the one hand and their Christianity on the other hand. And whereas the tension does make things more complicated to explain, tensions like this also tend to make thinking and thinkers more creative, because they have to play off different ideas against each other, consider different points of view, and it becomes, as we'll see later on in the course, a very productive kind of thing. A lot of textbooks on the Renaissance and humanism will claim that humanists were essentially secular thinkers, that their whole movement was a kind of secular movement. But in fact, as we've seen from Petrarch, they were deeply concerned with morals, ethics, they're deeply concerned with religious belief, and you have to look at both sides of them. But from rhetoric, they do inherit this relative view of truth to some extent. And the rhetorical idea or perception of relative truth feeds into the way they look at history. Now, we've already seen that Petrarch looked at history as three distinct periods, not as one continuous plenum of, not much change like the medievals did, but as three very distinct and different periods. And for Petrarch, that was because of the change he saw in the linguistic culture of the different periods, the language and how that fit into the culture of the different periods. But the humanist concern for rhetoric also plays a role, because when you start off with at least a partial appreciation for a relativity of truth, then you have the possibility for looking at history as not governed by one universal truth, as not governed by one universal plan, although they certainly did believe in providence. Here again we have the tension with their Christian inheritance. But the humanist historical perspective tended to see each historical period as unique and different. Antiquity, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. Each of these periods has its own set of truths that it operates on, its own set of truths that rules and governs it. Each period has its own characteristics and conditions and circumstances, just as different truths can be relative in different arguments. History doesn't repeat itself. That would follow from this, because each period is unique and different. Each period has its own truths and circumstances and conditions. But this leads to other more disturbing ideas that the humanists had to wrestle with. If each period of history is unique and different, then that pretty much means that it's very difficult to compare periods. If each one operates on its own set of truths, its own values, its own laws, then it's really hard to compare periods because they're just so different. But of course, the humanists made their living comparing periods. They said, antiquity was better than the Middle Ages. Middle Ages worse. Our period better. So they do compare the periods, and it's difficult when you consider each period operating on its own truths and conditions and circumstances. But even more disturbing is the fact that if each period is unique and different, then you shouldn't be able to bring a past period back. In other words, the humanists should not be able to replicate antiquity in their own day, because it, as a unique period, is past and gone, and you can't really replicate it. Well, a number of humanists realized these contradictions, and what they argued was that they were not really trying to bring back antiquity exactly, not to imitate it or bring it back like a photograph and you just slavishly imitate it. They were saying that they would bring antiquity back in a modified version, using its answers in modified ways to apply to problems of their own day that would make these answers practically useful. In fact, many of the humanists argued that if you just bring back antiquity completely like it was, it's not really going to perfectly match up with the problems you've got. You need to be flexible, adapt, change some of the solutions a little bit to apply them to your own day. And in that sense, you can actually do it. You can bring back a version of antiquity, although it's not going to be the same thing. And the period you create, while being very, very classically influenced, will not be classical antiquity itself. And a number of humanists realized this. Some of the others really didn't discuss the problem very much. But it shows you the tension and complexities that develop when you start to have this quintessentially modern view of history as a series of different periods with great change between the periods, and it being difficult to compare the periods and difficult to replicate, past periods. But also for modern historical thinkers, this humanist historical perspective stress some things that are very important for the way we think about history today. For example, the humanists would argue that you can't judge periods of history based on ideas and conditions and standards taken from another period. Meaning, you really can't judge antiquity based on standards and conditions and criteria that you take from your own period. and vice versa. You can't judge your own period from conditions and standards you take directly from antiquity. Now again, that's going to stress the humanists' desire to bring back antiquity as much as they can, but it really feeds into the modern notion that when you're judging history, you have to judge periods on their own standards. You have to judge antiquity by the standards of its generation, the modern period by the standards of its generation. And I think that's what most modern historians do, although you can see the tensions that created for the humanists when they realized that you can't make these direct comparisons and judgments using classical ideas, for example, to judge 15th century Florence. So there's tensions and problems and complexities there. And when you see all these ideas, the humanist idea of ethics and their idea of history, you start to see how deep and sophisticated and in fact varied humanist thought really was. Even though we've kind of sketched out this picture of humanist education as being a very clear, goal-oriented, driven kind of thing, which it was, most humanist thinkers were sophisticated thinkers and had to deal on many different theoretical levels with a lot of these problems we've been realizing. Well, this humanist view of history did have practical consequences. For example, we've already noted that the humanists were not the first people to read the classics. That the classics were read in the Middle Ages. But this humanist view of history caused the humanists to read the classics in a different way. And here's what I mean by that. In the Middle Ages, because of their view of history as one long, continuous plenum, and the Roman Empire is still really here, and we're latter-day Romans and all that, when they read the classics, they tended to read them as if they were written by people pretty much like them, in times pretty much like theirs, where not much had changed since then. And that's the way they interpreted the classics, and they got a very specific picture of the classics from that. The humanists read classics in a different way, as being from a different period, representing a different culture, giving a window onto a different society, a different way of life in many ways, and they recognize the difference. They attempt to draw lessons from the past without assuming that the past is like the present, that nothing's much changed. They see the classical writers as writing in a different period with different concerns in many ways and giving ideas, forward into the future that can be used, but that aren't exactly the same as ideas and concerns that people in the 15th century would have had. So it causes the humanists to read the classics in a different way. It also leads, and this is the final point I'll make, to the humanist stress on the science or the new discipline of philology, the study of the change of the Latin language over time. Incredibly important for the humanists. They could date books from it, as we've seen. They could assign authors from it, as we've seen. They could tell you what style was from what period, what author. They knew the language backwards and forwards. And this had also some very practical consequences. For example, the famous humanist philologian Lorenzo Valla, who essentially was probably the father of humanist philology, was the guy who discovered that the donation of Constantine, trotted out by the Pope for many centuries as proving his supreme rule over all of Europe, was a forgery. And Valla just said, he worked in the papal library, he took out a copy of it, he read it, and he said, the Latin style here is not in the style of Constantine's day. It's 8th or 9th century medieval Latin. And so this is a forgery. And that showed people that philology and the humanist concern for language could have a very practical effect and very important practical effect as well.